And I need today to introduce you to our very special guest, Carolin. Carolin, give us a quick wave. Here she is, enjoying the Scottish sunshine, I've just heard. So, Carolin, you need to make the most of that, and welcome. So, listen, Caroline's got a really interesting background. 15 or so years at Credit Suisse in various roles, but latterly as operational risk manager, director, then headhunted to Capula Investment Management as global operational risk manager, and recently, just recently, struck out on her own, and set up Schönherr. Am I pronouncing that right, Carolin? Brilliant. Risk advisory services. So today's session is all about operational resilience. And I've got a quote here from my friend Megan Butler at the FCA, who said, operational resilience is not about protecting the reputation of your firms or the reputation of the industry as a whole. It is about preventing operational incidents from impacting consumers, financial markets, and the UK financial system as a whole. So with that in mind, on March the 29th, 2021, the UK regulators jointly published a clear timeline for operational resilience requirements, with a first delivery milestone of March 2022. As you've heard, I'm reading that because we have an expert in the room who can take us through it. Carolin, I'm going to pass over to you to take us forward. But with one thing before I do, Carolin has requested to be interrupted, asked questions to make this a really interactive session. So please do that. Carolin, over to you, and we'll be ready to interrupt.
Thank you, Mark. That's a brilliant introduction. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining, and thank you for your interest in operational resilience. As Mark said, I think it's a really important and interesting topic, because what it actually does is it starts thinking about when something happens, not if something happens, but when something happens. How, as a firm, are you able to withstand, absorb, and recover? And in that first sentence, I think we have really some of the main intellectual thinking of the regulators in the UK, but also internationally behind this. It's a slight shift, and it's a subtle shift, but it says, we're no longer saying, what if something goes wrong? What if we have a failure? What if we have an incident? But we're saying, we will. Something will go wrong. And are we, as a firm, prepared to withstand, i.e., not go bankrupt, not be unable to deliver, not completely freeze? Are we able to absorb? So can we absorb the stress from this event into our processes? And then can we recover? And actually, the deputy CEO at the Bank of England has put it quite nicely. He said he wants every firm to be in a war approach: withstand, absorb, recover. And a lot of what we want to talk about today comes back to the something will happen and withstand, absorb, and recover. What I want to do is, I really think this is most interesting when we talk about what everyone has experienced. And, you know, Mark, you called out Matt, and Matt actually joins us from Norway. So he has got a completely different experience from maybe some of us who've been in the UK system for a long time. So we can exchange thoughts. And I think that's where this is useful, when we can talk amongst ourselves to say, how are you doing this? What's working well for you? What's working not so well for me? And I want to maybe start out with 3-4 slides, talk you through that, talk you through the timeline, because that's quite critical here. And then we can talk about, you know, what you might think about in terms of questions in your organization, how you might think about this in your environment. So the really important point here is the regulator expects us to be proportionate. And proportionate means it depends on the activities of your firm. It depends what you're doing. So the answer for what does operational resilience means for Sabrina, what it means for Tatiana, and what it means for me will not be the same. It will depend on what our firm does, which market it is operating in, and what we do. Also, operational resilience is outcome-based. So it's focused on the outcome. It's focused on how we make our processes, our systems, our people, our technology, our third parties resilient. How do we make sure that we have that capacity? And it focuses on the protection of the financial system. And we'll see in a little bit why that is so important. So if I can invite you to bear that in mind, that it's proportionate, outcome-based, and it focuses on the protection of the financial system. So not on the firm. It doesn't say I want you as a firm to survive, but it says I want you as a firm to protect the financial system. And in terms of timelines, thank you, Mark. You'd already talked about the March publication. And I know this sounds a bit geeky, but it's really exciting when two regulators publish a joint paper, because basically that tells me as a practitioner that they're trying to come to an aligned approach, that they're trying to consolidate. So here in the UK, we have a policy statement, which is been issued on the 29th of March on operational resilience. And it gives us very, very clear guidelines. So it says we have a scope. So, UK banks, building societies, PRA designated investment firms, and insurers. It gives that in more detail if you want to read. But so the first question to me is, do I understand the scope of this? And, as we've heard in maybe other talks on this, this might also impact firms outside of this, but in the first wave and the first deliverable, those firms have to do something by next March. And by next March, so March 22, which by now is not so far away, if we take away the summer holidays, you as a firm must have. You have identified your important business services. So think about the activities of your firm and then define important business services. You must have set your impact tolerances, mapping, testing, lessons learned, comms plan, and document. So, I think just maybe in a moment to everyone's else, are you aware where your firm is on this journey? Do you know whether your firm has already identified important business services? Are you in a role where you need to do this? Is this part of your job? In which case, we should have a conversation. We should talk about how you're going to do this, how this is going to work for you. So March 22, there's a very clear milestone on what needs to be achieved. And I think with all of these, the regulators often follow a comply or explain approach. If for one of your businesses, you're going through a complete strategic realignment, and hence it doesn't make sense to identify important business services, call up your supervisor at the regulator and tell them why you're not doing it. Interestingly enough, you need to call them anyway. So think again, get that policy statement out, make sure that you know what you need to do. And then by March 25, the regulators expect the UK firms in scope to have a fully dynamic operational resilience capability. This involves an annual self-assessment. This involves lessons learned. This involves scenarios. So if you think about where you are today, step one always has to be an assessment of where you are today, what your capabilities are today, and then think about how can you get from where you are today, and can you meet those two milestones, and then keep doing it. This is not a one-off exercise. This is something that assumes that you will be doing that in your existing governance, in your existing teams.
Carolin, I don't know, you may be covering this later, and if so, please ignore me. But in terms of important business services, impact tolerances, mapping, etc., can you give examples of what a UK bank might be looking at there as opposed to an investment firm?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark. And that's actually, yes, I was going, but let's jump to that. So let's think about maybe the most basic banking activities, a UK-based retail bank that offers current accounts. All of us have a current account. So the PRA has actually given a worked example in their paper where they've said, for retail current accounts, if you were to think about, all the things you do as a bank that offers retail accounts, you have an HR department, you have an IT department, you have a finance department, but are they important business services that are providing a service to the market? No, they're internal services. They're not an important business service. So those are not an important business service. And then they said, well, you've got other things that you do, right? When you close accounts, that's a business service. When you open an account, that's a business service. But is it an important business service? Is it one that's protecting the system? No, because worst case, you leave the accounts open for a little while, and worst case, you don't open new accounts. But what is an important business service is something like you allow your customer to withdraw cash at the ATM. An important business service is that you actually provide an overdraft and charge interest at 300,000%. So again, it is almost a narrowing down lens when you say all the things we do, and that's business activities. And then you say, of those, which are the ones that are providing a service to the market? Not just internal, but to the market, right? Then you say, of those, which are important business services that are protecting the financial system. And so you really narrow it down. So for a UK retail bank, you could have maybe 6 or 7 important business service for the activity current account offering. So you go by business line, so to say. And then you'd say, as an investment manager, again, if I'm allowing customers to invest in my fund, I'm running the fund and I'm paying back a redemption at the end, the most basic, you would think, well, what's an important business service? Well, the important business service is that I'm providing effective trade execution. So when you have, many of you might have a share ISA. If you want to buy or sell in your share ISA, you want to rely on the firm executing that trade. Not in 3 weeks, because the market will have moved, but within the time frame you've agreed. Equally, you expect that you can get a statement, or in a fund context, a NAV. So those are important business services, but the guidance is very clear that there should only be a small number of important business services, because the required governance, the required process around this would otherwise become too cumbersome. Does that answer your question, Mark?
It does. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions on this sort of starting point of the governance of the policy statement? Has anyone read it?
I've got a question actually. And this is about, hi there, hi. This is about the timeline. So I work for an investment manager, and we are a core firm, not an enhanced firm.
Right.
So it's just a bit of a grey area for us in terms of, which kind of deadline do we follow? I've read the policy, but it doesn't seem to be clear for core firms what our deadline is.
And I think that's right. I mean, I think my experience is that there's a very clear lag, but the lag tends to be no more than 2 years, right?
Okay.
I also haven't found a clear timeline. So I would actually call you supervisor. I would literally call them and say, look, we've read the policy statement. We are reading that at the moment we cannot find a clear deadline for us. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
But I think, the assumption internally has to be that this will come down to the firms.
Okay. Yeah, I guess that's it. It's, if we're running this as a project, a regulatory project, it's going to the exec, asking for approval, asking for budget. But in order to really, show them that it's viable and there is that regulatory timeline, it's just quite difficult without it being sort of called out for a core firm.
And as I said, having set up risk at an investment, I completely hear you. Yeah. It is, you don't have yet the screws tight enough to be able to say this is the 9-month deadline. But again, I think if you maybe flip it to the other side, is to say you have an opportunity in a core firm because you've got a bit more time And so you can set this up and you can leverage what you already have, because you will have some sort of, disaster recovery, you will have some sort of BCM, you will have some sort of up risk. And you have now an opportunity to leverage and build that up in a way that, is effective, in a way that is, cost saving, but having maybe a little bit more time. But I would call you supervisor.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
If you read the paper, it is one of the required steps anyway for every firm.
Yeah.
To say, like, we're working through this, we expect this to come to us anyway. I mean, SMCR had about 2.5 years before it rolled out, so that's always a good
indication. Yeah,
it is. And again, the question, and when we talk about this, is which SMF is expected to own this?
That's a tricky one as well. For instance, but when we've had internal discussions about this, people assume that it would fall on the chief operating officer, but then the chief operating officer is sort of saying it should be dual responsibility between themselves and, say, the head of risk.
Yeah, so it's between SMF 24 and SMF 4, right?
Yeah.
Because I think, and again, it comes back to the size of the firm and the way that the senior management team is structured. So in a large investment bank, that answer will be very different into an investment manager that has 50 people. And again, it's that comply and explain approach. That as long as you have evidence on your governance meeting minutes that this has been adequately discussed and it was decided it is the SMF4 for whatever reason, then that is okay. But what you can't do is not discuss it. Yeah. Are there any other questions sort of on the starting assumption here? Thank you. Right. Well, in all honesty, this is my preferred slide and picture when we talk about operational resilience. Because basically, the important thing, I think, and that's what the Bank for International Settlement tells us, leverage what you have. Operational resilience is not a new science. Operational resilience is the result of effective operational risk management, of effective governance. It takes into account your existing risk appetite. It takes into account your existing BCP plan. And so again, I think it's that importance that, whenever there is a new flavor of the month, whenever there's a new buzzword around, people run around, set up a new team, set up a new thing, and forget what they already have. And that siloed approach is expensive and dangerous. And so I think really what this is an opportunity to say is start with an assessment of the maturity of your existing capabilities. Take an honest look at your control environment. Take an honest look at how effective is your governance at the moment. Do you have a true risk committee? Or is it more show and tell? We'll talk about what we've done this week or this month. Do you have a true understanding of scenario analysis? And again, I mean, does anyone here is involved in sort of third-party inventory risk analysis? How strong is that in your firm? And often the first question I ask is, do you have an inventory of all your legal contracts? Do you know what services you get from the firms and what you pay for? And then as a next step, do you actually get what you pay for? And do you pay for what you get? And those sound like really basic questions. But in many firms, people still pay for services that they don't need or they don't get. So if operational resilience is now asking us to map interdependencies, because that's what operational resilience asks us to do, is to map the interdependencies between the services, between the third party and the internal service. And I mean, many of you will have outsourced, at a guess, some of your IT service as a platform, software as a platform. You will have outsourced maybe some middle office functionality. Maybe you'll outsource some of the back office archiving and documentation services. So if you don't know where all those sit, if you don't know what all of those rely on in the chain, so both your distribution chain as much as your sourcing chain, you cannot understand and you cannot depict and explain to the regulator what your capabilities to withstand, absorb, and recover. So when we talk about those important business services, and Mark, thank you for pointing to that sort of, narrow lens at the beginning, really, we need to include third parties, super important, and we need to understand how they map. So again, whether your firm needs to do this today or in 2 years' time, having a good inventory of your third parties and having a good understanding of what they do for you is really important, because otherwise you can't map that. Does anyone have any experience in sort of these cross dependencies, or is it just a pretty picture? Or not even a pretty picture? Okay. Do we still, Matt, are you still on the line? Was he dropped? Okay.
We're still here, Carolyn. I'm still here anyway.
Yeah, no, that's fine. No, just going because Matt actually, Matt has done some great work in business resilience, and business continuity planning. Hi, Matt.
Hey, Carolyn. Sorry.
Don't worry. Do you mind if sorry, I'm pulling you out, sir. But do you mind to maybe giving your view, because I know that you've spent a lot of time in the sort of the BCP planning area.
I have. Sorry, I hadn't got my camera on, partly because I'm sunburned.
That's fine. I'm glad Norway's as sunny as Scotland is all I can say.
Yes, very, very toasty here. Yeah, look, I mean, I would echo the remarks you made early on in the session, that this is about bringing together existing disciplines. It's not something new, and very much leveraging the work that is done already in supplier management, in just process engineering, actually, in enterprise architecture. It's around technology resilience and trying to ensure that our IT risk management is actually integrated. And quite often what happens in firms is it all gets very siloed and isolated. And really what we're trying to do here in operational resilience and in meeting the regulators' expectations, I think, is bringing together all the different threads of risk management and telling a story about how are we managing these risks. Yeah. So it's a large part is stakeholder engagement, getting people on the same hymn sheet, which is probably a bit harder than just saying that.
It is, isn't it? And it's sort of almost trying to tell people the why and the what they get out of it. And I've moved from a big investment bank where you didn't have to explain the why that much, because it was already preset to an investment, to a hedge fund, basically, where people just looked at me and said, but why do we want to do this? We just moved to Hong Kong. I was like, oh yeah, that's another way of thinking about it. But the way that you kept someone's attention is to say, look, we spent so much time implementing really exciting trade ideas. Shouldn't we try to not lose money? Shouldn't we try to maximize the profit we can make? And I always, if you frame operational risk management, operational resilience as protection of the revenue stream and protection of the firm, then that gets more interest. It's maybe the only way I can describe it. And so we have actually, one of our members has had the opportunity to be both in the audit function and in the operational risk team. So I'm not sure, Kamaldi, whether you would be happy to maybe share your thoughts on this. This is awful, just putting her on the spot. Hi. You're mute, Kamaldeep. You're mute. You're mute.
Sorry. Thanks, Carolyn. I was on mute indeed. So I think it's really good to listen this topic from you, and it's more of a listen and learn from you. But currently I'm in one of the investment banks, and I think from my perspective, we're still at early stages, but and it's important to sort of be prepared and have that understanding within the business to think from that scenario's perspective, because from my perspective, one of the challenges that we face is that to develop that understanding and thinking in the business minds that this is how you need to think. And why is this important? Why spending time on imagining those situations and then coming up with those controls that this may happen and we need to be ready with this. I think developing that mindset is one of the most important things. And I think that's one of the challenges that I personally face. But I think once you
once we do have some individuals from that level, and once that understanding is there, then it's a bit easier to navigate, and then, you know, have those discussions around, okay, what are the controls, and then involve those SMEs, and I think from that angle.
And you know, and you know, Kamala, what you just said there is that once you have that, and you know, the operational resilience assumption is that it's a self-assessment that's done annually. It's a dynamic capability. So there's scenarios, there's lesson learned, and that's where, you know, the leveraging the operational risk framework is so powerful, because that's what a mature operational risk framework has always done, right? We've always done incident reviews and look backs and read acrosses. And so if you take that and you take that into the operational resilience framework, all of a sudden you actually have a lot of it already.
Completely agree. Yes. And and I think then the whole linkage of how everything comes together, that's obviously that helps in having some contextual data as a starting point to also analyze which direction we need to go into.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Is there anyone else who's got sort of any good, bad, or ugly experiences with this pulling this together, or any questions? Another thought maybe then is what questions you might want to consider in your operational resilience approach. And I think that, again, because it can get so detailed, right? And you can get so bogged down in reading all the policy statements, but sometimes that big picture I find quite important. And I think the first point, and that spoke to the lovely lady who spoke earlier, whose name I unfortunately can't see on the screen anymore. You're saying, you know, being a core firm, the first question is, do those rules apply to us now or later? So scope, understanding where you sit on the scope, understanding what your firm's strategy is, because it might well be, you know, if you are in one bracket, but you're changing your activity significantly and you're either growing or shrinking significantly, it might be that the rules come to apply to you sooner than you think. So again, alignment with strategy is really important here. The other thing is to say, what do we actually do? You know, if all I'm doing is I'm offering retail current accounts and credit cards to individuals, then my important business services will look very different than if I'm selling research and I'm an investment manager and I'm a CHAPS payment provider. So again, understanding what we do as a firm, where we want to be or where we need to be, and how we map that against the operational resilience timeline is really, really important. And we've already talked about the accountability, but in your organization, who will be the senior manager who owns the operational resilience deliverable? Will it be the CRO because they already own operational risk? Well, I think it has to, you know, most likely will be a mixture. It will be dual reporting now, because often the COO might own some of the business recovery, business continuity planning, third party. So again, who owns what part and how do you make it work? And what's the governance? What governance do you have in place that you can leverage? Because you don't need a completely new governance structure. You don't need a completely new team. You need to pull this together. And I think that resonates really well with what Matt was saying, is the challenge here is about leveraging. The challenge here is about being clever. Because otherwise this can be a cottage industry that's going to keep all of us very busy for the next 25 years and hasn't necessarily been a better risk management outcome. And the important thing is, if we want to improve, and that comes back to my very 3 points at the beginning, we want to improve protect the financial system. It needs to be proportionate. It needs to be outcome-based. So rather than having endless spreadsheets with very granular business services, let's focus on the important ones. Let's be clear in our governance from what we're trying to achieve. And what we already have, because you might already have the most amazing vendor management somewhere, but if you don't know about it and you can't pull it into this, it is useless. And then again, I think, you know, we talked about project plan and project governance. So what are our steps? How do we want to become compliant? You know, if for one reason or another, the firm doesn't have enough resources to meet the 22 deadline, call your supervisor today, agree a plan. Don't just put it in the cupboard and go like, ooh, a bit difficult, ooh, don't know what to do here. Come up with a plan. I know you laugh, Leslie, but it's not that, I mean, people do that. They might not know that they put it back in the cupboard, but they go like, oh, a bit difficult. We're not going to deal with that right now, a bit later. Let's recognize that, comply or explain. If you cannot, for one reason or another, deal with this, call your supervisor and agree a plan. telling them in March 22 that the dog ate the homework ain't going to help. And then be honest internally what you can achieve. And if you can only pilot, 2/3 of your business and get that framework robustly set up there, then that's what you do. And then you onboard the next ones. But you need to be clear what this means and what you can achieve here. And again, I think, going forward, when you do scenario analysis, when you do lessons learned, realistic approach has to be the way forward, because otherwise it's a very difficult thing to do. And then it's, it's set up for failure. So again, I think opening up the floor, are there questions on how to do this? On questions on how you would go about it? Anyone feel that they're going to run off after this into the afternoon and go, I want to map business services? Mark wants to. I can hear him.
You can hear me. You can hear me. I'm trying to think of some questions. Carolin, you've done a marvelous job there. Where just generally, where do you think the industry are? What's your assessment of people's progress and readiness for March 2022?
I think overall, the big banks, people are aware, but still burying their head in the sand because there's something more pressing and the budget hasn't been approved yet and whatever. I think there will be a real rush when we come back in September, because then it's less than 6 months, close enough to year-end performance. It is now part of people's performance plans and their comp for next year. And it's close enough to 6 months that people can imagine that this is their problem. So we'll come back in September, there'll be a real rush for people going, we must do this, we have to do this. I think the issue is that doesn't give people enough time to go about in a thoughtful manner. And to me, the smaller firms are the ones that are maybe not in here, sometimes maybe are not even aware of it. And I think they're the question, Heather, you make a good point, is saying you're already thinking about it. But I think it's those firms who are not even thinking about it yet, that at some point the regulator will say, enough is enough. We've told you about this for a long time now. They fined Citi for governance. They fined Rafael's for outsourcing. They have made their point. And at some point they will say, what will it take to get people over the line? So I think we're at, is that when you can feel the tremors and the earthquake isn't here yet, but you can feel the tremors. And I'm not a betting woman, but if I was, I would say September, the urgency will be visible. Okay.
And what do you think then in terms of, as this starting point, if you go back to your previous slide, for most banks, how big a job is this? And why haven't they been considering operational resilience before?
It's an interesting question, but Mark, if you have lots of teams and chiefs in place already, and you now tell them that it's not 5 different fiefdoms anymore, but it's one big one. So I think the challenge here is to say, Matt said, we have someone in IT risk who's responsible for IT risk. You have someone in BCP who's responsible for BCP. You've got someone who's responsible for op risk. And you're now trying to pull this together in one coherent and cohesive framework that uses business services as the link for the sake of a better work, as a unique identifier in the middle. It requires a culture change. It requires a different mind map, quite literally. Mm-hmm. And I think that is where it's actually, the technicalities underneath it, there's still quite a lot of work to do, but it's not actually the main problem. The main problem is that you need to turn around and you need to say, we're thinking about this differently. This is the change to approach. This is outcome-based, proportionate, and the system, not the firm. This doesn't care whether Credit Suisse, UBS, Deutsche survive. This cares about whether the system survives.
Yeah.
And that, I think that to me is the main challenge here, is that you need someone internally to stand up and say, this is what we're going to do. And I know that you in IT have never spoken to that person in BCM, and you have never spoken to that person over here, and you don't speak the same language and you don't think the same way. and still we will all work together.
Yeah. We have a few hands up. So coming to Leslie first. You've got your camera on, Leslie.
Hi, Caroline. Brilliant, really interesting. Do you think there's maybe a feeling with, my main background is insurance rather than banking, that they feel we've done all of this, we must have it, it's not that important to focus on it?
I think insurance companies have done much more naturally, if that makes sense. In some areas,
that's kind of what I was thinking, because
in some areas, I would maybe submit that insurers have had sort of well, we're doing scenario analysis. That's how we price our insurance. You know, we know what we insure. But again, you know, have they mapped the interconnectivity? Have they thought about what they have outsourced? Have they thought about where their dependencies are? And so maybe I would submit that the insurance companies, they almost feel like they're being told to do what they should know already, and hence they shouldn't have to do what the regulator tells them. But maybe it's an opportunity to learn from the banks. And maybe it's an opportunity for the banks to learn from the insurers. Yeah. And say, what have both of us done very well? Because that's our natural habitat, right? Tell a banker to model something in Excel and they get excited. That's what people do. That's what you're brought up to do. And so I think you're absolutely right.
Right now, I get it completely. It's just I've seen with my insurance risk manager friends that they kind of think, well, actually, we've just got to put it in a report. We already know how to do this. We've already got our risk register.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
But again, I would maybe ask the question back, what do you do with that report? Because by just putting in a report, you've ticked a box, but you actually haven't made anything better. Yeah. And, you know, I always think that people, a lot of people say, oh, we've done this, we can't do it. But I think what COVID has shown us is that the speed of the virus in the different locations has meant that my supply chain, the location of my supply chain mapped against the velocity of the virus.
Mm.
And I mean, if you want to
avoid using the C word.
No, I know, but I think it's but just in terms
it's changed the landscape. You're absolutely right.
Hasn't it? And, you know, I always say, you know, again, in my experience, people are happy to talk about third parties. If you go crazy, they talk about fourth parties. But that's already, I mean, that's crazy stuff. God forbid about fifth parties, or indeed concentration risk in the supply chain. You know, all the banks and, you know, all the banks have concentrated, outsourced, or their own setup, but they're in, you know, in Pune, in Chennai, in wherever. If the virus hits a location, then Deutsche, Credit Suisse, UBS, JPMorgan, blah, 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 and the insurers, I'm sure, have the same places, because that's where you get really good talent that have trained. So, but if the virus hits that center of outsource, and that's your third party, you might know about it. If it's your internal, if it's your own entity, you might know about it. But if it's a fourth or fifth party, you might not even know it's sitting there. And I think, you know, when you then say to people, what you could take it a step further and say, well, where do these people store their data? And everyone has it with AWS. And you go, right, and what due diligence have you done? They go, oh, can't do due diligence, they don't let us. Like, okay, they don't let us. So yeah, I think it's a brilliant, I find it exciting, just in case that didn't come through.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Smruti, am I pronouncing your name right? I doubt it.
Yes, you are.
Okay, good.
Difficult name. It's a very good. Hi, hello, Mark. How are you? And hello, everybody. How are you all?
We're all good, thank you.
Great. I haven't been in the banking industry for 10 years now, but what I can say is that many of these resilience blocks are because there's not a meaningful KPIs or metrics produced. The KPIs are archaic and they are not changing constantly to the new rules, regulations which have come, and that creates operational resilience and avoids what happens to that is that there are also that builds up blocks. And if when the blocks are not built in properly or analyzed properly, understanding of building the blocks properly or analyzed properly to unblock those things, it carries on like that. And from my experience, what I had is many people who are in the management area or anywhere, they go by the book. Yeah, it's continuously by the book, instead of thinking in a broad spectrum of mindset in a holistic way and say, okay, right, this is how the functions are, this is how it should be. And that was where I encountered various times in project management or operational issues which I had to deal with relating to projects or transitions of third party and things like that. People just ticked without realizing, okay, why they're doing that, looking into deeper and meaningful way. And that's where I think that's where the operational resilience should be changed to a certain extent. Thank you.
I think I fully agree. And you know what? That leads me beautifully. Matt has very kindly volunteered to share with us. He was leading the operational resilience mapping and analysis nationwide a few years ago. And so, Matt, would you mind if I call you out? Sorry, thank you.
No, that's fine. Yeah, just because you guys don't know who I am, I'm the head of resilience at Norwegian Central Bank, as the sovereign wealth fund at the moment. But in a prior life was head of resilience strategy at Nationwide. Some of the retail banks have been interested in resilience since, well, shortly after 2012, when the RBS incident happened. There was a major IT outage for several weeks, and that led to some regulatory intervention with some of the retail banks through 2012 to 2015, before this latest set of guidance has come out. And one of the things we did at Nationwide was we went through this process of doing end-to-end process mapping or service mapping against what they were calling at that time critical economic functions, but are really essentially important business services. And just getting that cross-functional lens, cross-organizational lens was a bit of a challenge. We were competing against things like customer journeys and other ways of cutting the organization. And so that was probably the first challenge, is try and get people aligned around a way of viewing the organization, and then getting people to speak that language, and not just for the purpose of a report, but actually for managing that risk on an ongoing basis. I don't think the regulator is going away. We then, you have to go into the IT teams and get them to not just talk about IT services, but actually relate that to the process steps that you're concerned about, and to actually then ask yourself the question of, well, what does good look like? How are we doing? If we're doing gap analysis against a set of standards, what is that standard that we're hoping to achieve, and how far off that are we? And if we do have some resilience gaps, to Carolin's point, what are we going to do about them? Over what time frame, and how are we going to invest in those? And how do we prioritize investment candidate X over investment candidate Y? So there's quite a lot of work to be done to actually take operational resilience and turn it into something real and tangible that the regulator has confidence that they're, from their perspective, the systemically important risks are being managed. But from the organization's perspective, how are you investing your money wisely to manage your own risk? Because you can take it as an opportunity to really focus on your own institutional resilience, as well as address the regulators' requirements. But there are lots of practical challenges. I think getting people to understand the language set is probably one of the key internal obstacles, particularly then also dealing with multiple regulations as well. We've got this set of regulation in the UK, but there's also some regulatory papers coming out from the EBA and from the US authorities as well. So trying to get joined up is a bit of a challenge. Sorry, Caroline, I'll leave it there.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Matt. And that is, I think that how to do it in real life is, I think, what we're all here for, right? Because everyone can read the papers by themselves, but the reality is, if you sit there and you're most likely have maybe, like Lisa, just landed in an organization, and you look around you and you say, so what do I have? What do I need to get to? And how do I make it work? And, that's the very layman's description of, do a gap analysis. You think about what good looks like, and then you come up with a roadmap of how to implement it. And that also comes back to vision and strategic alignment. And to me, Matt, what you touched on there is that how to make it a value-add activity. Because we can all sit here and draw up Excel or some database solution lists of business services and risk registers, but fundamentally we do this to make better and informed decisions. And fundamentally we do this to protect the customer and the financial system. And so to me, really, this is what I think operational resilience is brilliant. It is starting to think about why. It's not just the how, it's not just the what, it's the why. So yeah, I think, and I know someone said they need to leave after half an hour. I think we managed to keep most people on for quite a long time, but this is a thrilling topic. And I suspect as we journey over the next 18, 24 months, who knows, maybe we need to come together and see how everyone has been doing and mapping those and where the challenges are.
Carolin, we've got a couple probably of last questions. One from Heather, and then I'll invite Mihaela to come and join us. So Heather, first of you.
Yeah, so again, just sort of thinking about getting buy-in from exec members and senior stakeholders when it comes to operational resilience. What would you say would be the risks of not doing operational resilience? Obviously, as a core firm, we don't have to meet that regulatory deadline, but if we don't do it, reputational risk, but what other kind of risks would be sort of open to us if we didn't do this?
So I had exactly that same conversation at Capula, right? Because they said, well, we don't have to do it, we'll move to Hong Kong, etc. So we had exactly that conversation. And I then found myself in a board meeting with a founder. And I said, I ended up discussing tail risk management with him. I said, look, what I do in operational risk management is I'm concerned about tail events and I'm concerned about protecting your revenue. So actually, you are really good at managing a trading book. You're really good at managing, events in the market. So if we just think that I want to protect the revenue stream from that for you, that's what I'm trying to do here. And so a strong way you can look at that, I suspect if you're an investment manager, you will have a trade error policy, and I suspect you will have insurance policies that will cover any incident.
Yeah.
So I would pull how much you've claimed from insurance. I would pull your trade error policy, and I would map that over the last 12 rolling month, and I would add that to your dashboard reporting. Okay. And I would say, until now, you've been able to offset X% of your losses with insurance. However, at the next renewal, it might well be that the insurance company might question either your premium or your excess. So number one, it's a financial risk. You're protecting a financial risk because you're protecting, you're protecting their losses. But what you're also doing is more and more due diligence questionnaires include not just ESG and op risk, but also operational resilience questions. And due diligence firms like Castle Hall, etc., ask more and what you do. So again, I would say, what is your DD material?
Okay.
And thirdly, I would say, do you issue a SOC report? Service control, yeah. So if you issue a SOC report as a service organization, people issue service organization control reports. I would just say, if you were to misstate your internal controls in there, you have more than a reputational risk. We have now a legal risk.
Okay, thank you.
Is that helpful?
It is very helpful. Thank you.
Super. Good. So we had another question. Mark, you're mute.
Mihaela, do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Mihaela?
No worries.
I had to pick up a work call.
No worries. Caroline, do you want to round off? You've obviously raised some good points here, but also you've got your contact details on there for anyone who is interested in learning more. What's final bit of advice? Final thoughts?
I think my final thought, and I think the main point to take away here is, as an organization, are you cognizant of whether you're in the rules for now? Are you in scope? And if so, do you know who's going to be responsible for this, and do they have a plan? And I think if you can answer those three things for your organization, are we in scope? Who's going to own this internally? And do we have a plan? Then the next parts are part of that roadmap, of that implementation journey. Anyway, anyone drop me a line. I'm happy to distribute the slides. If you email me, I'm happy to give you some reading list on, as Matt's pointed to. There is international guidance, there's US policy, and there's EBA policy, there's UK. I can send you some materials, we can have a chat on this. But I think to me, how do you take this forward? I think actually just asking the question in your organization, what are we doing about operational resilience? Is this a requirement for us? If so, who's running the project? And can I get involved? And I would like to thank you, everyone, for giving up a sunny day, be it in England, Scotland, or Norway, to talk about operational resilience. It's been a pleasure.
Carolin, thank you. Thank you very much. Brilliant session. Brilliant. I need to apologise to Mihaela. Her microphone isn't working, but there's a note in the chat there. Mihaela, we'll try and pick that up. Brilliant. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining. Just a couple of plugs about some E2W events coming up. So next week on the 8th of June, which is Tuesday at 6 o'clock, our coach, one of our coaches, Zoe Copley, is talking about saying no in order to say yes. That's a brilliant session. I've seen what's happening on there. It's being hosted by Joy, who's on the call here today, and Katie. So come and join us for that. That's 6 o'clock next Tuesday. And then our coffee break next week. A similar theme, really. Your most powerful mindset. We're being joined by Kim van Nijkerk, who will be talking about powerful mindsets. Really interesting, both personal development events. Come along and join us. A recording of this for our members will be in the LinkedIn group, hopefully later today. Just leaves me to say, enjoy the sunshine whilst it's here. Caroline, thank you very much. Katie, as always, brilliant. Thank you. See you all next week. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Bye. Bye.